Hi everyone. Welcome back to Poems That Changed Me. You've returned, which is a miracle. Or you're here for the first time, also a miracle. Either way, you're lucky because today's poem is spectacular. It's also an incredibly important poem that I think helped change the landscape of poetry. It's from Claudia Rankine's 2014 book, Citizen. If you don't know the book is a series of essays, prose poems, photographs, and traditional lineated poems, many of which explore microaggressions around race and sometimes gender and the intersection of the two. This is a poem from a series of untitled prose poems, and this is one of my favorites. The new therapist specializes in trauma counseling. You've only ever spoken on the phone. Her house has a side gate that leads to a back entrance she uses for patients. You walk down a path bordered on both sides with deer grass and rosemary to the gate, which turns out to be locked. At the front door, the bell is a small round disc that you press firmly. When the door finally opens, the woman standing there yells at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house! What are you doing in my yard?" It's as if a wounded Doberman Pinscher or a German Shepherd has gained the power of speech. And though you back up a few steps, you manage to tell her you have an appointment. "You have an appointment?" She spits back. Then she pauses. Everything pauses. "Oh," she says, followed by, "Oh yes, that's right. I am sorry. I am so sorry. So sorry." Well, this poem changed a lot for me. First, I love the use of the second person in this poem, the use of the you. This entire book asks the reader to consider the effects of racial microaggressions on the individual. And so for white readers who might not have thought much about microaggressions, that could be an uncomfortable or a tall order. But one of the genius moves that Claudia does here is the use of the second person, which places the reader in the position of the author, so that we are the person being yelled at. And that does a lot to narrow the distance between the author, Claudia Rankine, and the viewer, who might be a white guy, and not normally in the position of experiencing racial microaggressions. So this reversal of placement is really important to the experience of the poem. Secondly, this poem, in terms of how it looks and how it sounds, does not really present like a traditional lyric poem. When I've taught these poems in class, my students have always asked, what makes this a poem? And for sure, semiotically, the poem is not lineated. It looks like prose. And syntactically, Claudia doesn't use anaphora or alliteration or assonance or rhyme or figurative language. In fact, the poem is notably void of those things. It might remind you a little bit of Carolyn Forché's poem, The Colonel, which is also in prose, also uses the second person, and is journalistic in tone, objectively rendered rather than subjectively rendered. And that gesture, that decision, gives the poem and the experience some real credibility, because it removes any sense of flair or over-dramatization or over-presentation or theatricality that could be leveled at the poem in order perhaps to elicit some effect on the viewer. So the poem's sort of minimalist use of the poetic toolbox is actually, I think, a brilliant poetic move. But the other thing that I find really interesting about this poem, and I've written about it, this is in reference to the entire book, is what I call Claudia's documentary poetics. As I was reading this book, this is back in 2014, I found myself making connections between the poems in this book and the photographs of Dorothea Lange in particular. And that made me think of this really fascinating book by a guy named William Stott, who taught in the American Studies program at the University of Texas for decades. This book is called Documentary Expression. And what he argues is that the photographs of people like Lange and Walker Evans perform what he calls social documentary. And one of his arguments is that these photographs were so impactful because he said they educate our emotions. They teach us how to feel. And he goes on to say that these photographs call attention to situations that are neither necessary nor permanent, that can be remedied, like racism, poverty, sexism. And I kept thinking about how the poems in this book educate our emotions. They teach us how to feel about racial injustice. And I think that this is one of the real contributions of this book, not only to poetry, but to larger society. Because Claudia is so smart about language. In this poem, the tiniest poetic moments, like the comparison to a dog gaining the power of speech, and then that sentence, everything pauses, perfectly encapsulates these moments that are filled with tension that so many people of color experience just living in America. The ability of Claudia to turn these moments into these instances of poetry is pure genius. It really changed a lot for me. And if you haven't read this book, I encourage you to do so. This poem and the other texts in the book will absolutely and completely change things for you as well.